Hello, I'm Rebecca Rotenberg, the associate editor of the Washington Quarterly, and I'm very excited to be hosting the inaugural episode of TWQ Talks, a digital interview series spotlighting the research and expertise of all the scholars and practitioners who contribute to our journal every quarter. And today I have the pleasure of talking to Audrey Wong. Audrey's John Kirkpatrick Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and an assistant professor of political science and international relations at the University of Southern California. She is also one of the authors, along with Viking Bowman and Victor A. Ferguson, of an article in the fall issue of the Quarterly breaking down China's sanction strategy and how it's been evolving. So, Audrey, thank you so much for joining me today, and it's a pleasure to talk about your piece.
Thanks, Rebecca. Great to be here.
So, I guess we can get started with the title of your article, which is The Old Logic Behind China's New Economic Weapons. So, maybe a good place to start is by giving us the kind of bird's eye view of what China's old and new weapons actually are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you could say China's sort of approach traditionally to economic coercion, economic sanctions has been characterized by a very informal style. Rather than the Chinese government saying, we're going to sanction you because you did this, they prefer to be much more ad hoc, much more vague. And actually denying sort of political motivations for imposing those sanctions and denying official state, government involvement, right? And so that would basically be saying, okay, Chinese consumers are boycotting this company or these goods, because of grassroots sentiment. So it's not the Chinese state that's pushing, these coercive measures, or using sort of other reasons, non-political reasons as pretext. So saying we can't import this agricultural good because it doesn't meet our food safety standards. We've found pests, or pesticides, right, which don't follow our regulatory laws in China. So that's sort of the old weapons, I guess, these sort of more informal approach to economic sanctions. And what we're seeing today, and especially in recent years, right, is sort of this emergence of what many have called new economic weapons, right, and that's increased formalization, legalization of these coercive measures, right, and so China has instituted, sort of announced a spate of legal frameworks, right, from the unreliable entities list to the anti-foreign sanctions law to sort of very formal export controls, right? And so we see much more institutionalized ways of imposing these economic sanctions on foreign companies and foreign governments.
And what are some key examples of this switch to the more formalized sanctions method in the last few years?
Yes, so you see a range of examples. Like, for example, you see companies like PVH or Illuma being added to the unreliable entities list, because they've quote unquote, violated sort of national security, or violated national security concerns in China. We see the more explicit use of export controls on rare earths, right, where China has very strategic bargaining leverage on global supply chains. And so we see that happening in the trade war with the Trump administration, right, compared to the first trade war, where I think China tended to rely on more informal measures. This time it's not hesitated to sort of be more explicit in saying, okay, you're going to impose 104% tariff or 145%, whatever that number is, right? And saying we're going to respond, right, with these by adding these companies to certain lists and imposing export restrictions or import restrictions for those political reasons.
And so I know you and your co-authors documented a data set kind of tracing how China's sanctions balance has been evolving between the old and new and between proactive and reactive sanctioning. What was kind of interesting or surprising to you all as you went through this research process about how China's been balancing these old and new weapons?
Yeah, well, I think certainly we're seeing that China has been using more of these new economic weapons, has been imposing more formalized sanctions. But at the same time, I think what was interesting was that we see sort of continued relative caution and constraint in how China is using these formal sanctions. So, one, as you alluded to, right, a lot of times these formal sanctions have been used in very reactive ways, right? And so, as countermeasures, counter sanctions, right? Portrayed as very proportionate self-defense measures in response to U.S. and sort of Western sanctions, right, seeking to constrain China and contain China, as opposed to sort of being used, proactively. In the past, China has used a lot of informal sanctions, right, to try to pressure the countries on the Taiwan issue, on territorial disputes in the South China Sea, for example. But in this case, right, we're seeing formal sanctions really being dominated by a very reactive mindset. Of course, one exception I think is Taiwan, right, where China has been more proactive in using formal measures, but at the same time, it's continued to sort of try to limit economic fallout and sort of use these formal measures in sectors like, against U.S. defense companies, right, where it doesn't actually fundamentally, undermine or alter the economic relationship between the two countries. And I would say sort of the second interesting finding we had is that, we definitely need more attention to understand these formal sanctions and how they're being used. But we're seeing that these new weapons are being used in a complementary way to the old weapons, right? And so they're not substituting necessarily for the informal style that China has traditionally used, but actually complementing them. And so we're seeing in the current trade war, for example, right, China using both formal and informal measures sort of bring a whole suite of tools to bear against a range of sectors, against a range of companies. And so in that sense, you see China trying to get the best of both worlds. Not giving up its traditional approach. And I think, in fact, in some ways, right, when it imposes formal sanctions, it's still sort of you could see it as formality of Chinese characteristics in some sense, where these measures, do retain some level of flexibility in enforcement, some level of uncertainty, ambiguity, right? That China hasn't always been very clear, right, what the red lines are in its use of these formal sanctions.
And does that extend to enforcement in the sense that is it common now, even as sanctions become more formalized, that the kind of off-ramps still maintain a sense of ambiguity, or do targets of sanctions, are they kind of increasingly knowing what steps they need to take for sanctions to be lifted formally?
Yeah, I think there's still quite a bit of ambiguity. And for example, you could take the, recent, example of export controls, export restrictions on rare earths that China has imposed during the trade war, right, where China has not hesitated to flex its muscle, but still retained flexibility in some sense because, you know, um, there have been delays, right, despite sort of the agreement between ostensible agreement between the Chinese and US governments, right, that they're going to roll back some of these export controls and they're going to resume exporting these critical minerals, right. There's been a lot of concern that China is slow rolling, right, this process and not actually holding up its end of the deal. And
Mhm.
some see that as an intentional, deliberate, coercive measure, right? China sort of saying, like, look, we still have a lot of leverage. Others have pointed to the sort of very simple, mundane, bureaucratic reason, right, that there are delays in processing a huge number of export licensing applications by foreign companies because it's all coming down to a few people in this tiny bureau that no one ever knew about, right, in the Ministry of Commerce. And so it's actually because they just don't have the capacity, right, to deal with these approvals at the requisite speed, right? And so that sort of lack of clarity, right, I think, illustrates some of that flexibility that China is using, where it can sort of have some leeway, have some maneuvering room, right, to tighten these restrictions, to sort of step back a little bit, right? I think depending in part on the political environment, right? It the sort of most recently said, oh, we have a 6 month suspension, right, of these export control measures. And so, that gives China some ability, right, to say, after 6 months, oh, look, things are not going the way we planned. We're going to sort of resume, right, some of these export restrictions. And we also see sort of potential ability, I think, for China to calibrate pressure by differentiating, right, whose applications get approved, right? Like, so maybe Volkswagen, right, which has traditionally been a very vocal advocate of cooperative relations with China, and retaining access to the Chinese market, right, could see its application being approved more quickly than, companies from the United States, for example. And so, again, sort of this flexibility allows China to sort of calibrate its pressure and, perhaps I think, take a more gloves off approach without actually being sort of overtly escalatory in that sense.
Mm. And how centralized is that effort of calibrating the sanctions? Like, does China have an equivalent of kind of OFAC? Is there a single agency that's coordinating Beijing's sanctions policy, or is it kind of fragmented across different ministries?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, right now it's, certainly I think Politburo and Xi Jinping, right, has a lot of attention to these sort of new economic weapons, if you will. But I think they're still sometimes trying to figure out sort of how best to enforce it, right? And I think certainly is not as centralized or institutionalized as in the United States with OFAC, for example. You have the Ministry of Commerce, you have a lot of different bodies potentially getting involved, and I think traditionally China actually has had, sometimes some challenges imposed in sort of actually enforcing some of the sanctions measures that it had wanted to do, because of principal agent problems, because of, lower level governments or companies trying to shirk some of these rules, right? And we see sort of headlines like, oh, that's been smuggling of gallium and other, critical minerals that China is trying to clamp down on. And so I think the formalized approach actually does have an advantage in allowing the Chinese government to more, quickly and strictly saying, okay, we're going to clamp down on, efforts within China, right, to circumvent our politically motivated measures.
Hmm. You've touched a couple times about Trump's trade war. Would you say that's kind of been a learning curve in real time for China and how they're evolving the way they calibrate sanctions, especially between the first iteration in Trump's first term and now in the second term?
Yeah, I think so. I think, this most recent iteration has shown China that, we need to look tough, right? We sort of, if we escalate, right, to some extent and sort of impose rate of export controls, and I think that's actually been a very explicit turn of events where it's one of the first times where China has really sort of directly impacted global supply chains in a very explicit and bold way. But I think this has taught China, right, that one, if it has a leverage in some of these sectors, it should use it, right, because it definitely brought the Trump administration back again and again to the negotiating table, right, hoping, right, for a good deal, whatever, a good deal is, right, for both parties. And I think China has learned that if it uses more of these formal measures, right, it's more credible, it sends a much stronger signal to foreign audiences, to the United States, right, that China is serious. And also, I think, allows Chinese government to tell its domestic audience, right, in China that it's standing up, right, to this unwarranted pressure and coercion by the United States and other countries, right? So I think definitely sort of the escalation of economic tensions with the United States, right, has taught China that needs to continue refining and improving and using. A broader set of economic tools and certainly a more formalized toolkit because that's speaking the language that the United States and many other Western governments have spoken in the realm of economic coercion.
Yeah, yeah. On the other hand, what are they potentially losing by kind of shaking off this ambiguity in the informal model?
Yeah, I think, the flexibility and ambiguity that China has, attempted to preserve in economic coercion, right, does allow off ramps. It allows China to sort of, take a step back, if, for example, a certain sanction is not working, saying, okay, we're gonna sort of, roll back on that without actually, having to overtly say, okay, this didn't work, we're not going to do it anymore, right? And so that, that sort of traditional informality and flexibility has allowed China to sort of avoid losing face, right, when it wants to ease back on certain economic restrictions, even if its demands haven't been met, right? So I think China's trying to figure out that trade-off between, allowing these off-ramps, preserving flexibility, right? With sort of better enforcement, better signaling, better ability to deter other countries from, provoking the ire of the Chinese government, right? And so that's certainly a trade-off has to think about in the realm of coercive bargaining. I think sort of maybe more broadly, right, if China sort of tries to transition, right, to a purely more formalized approach to economic sanctions, right, I think, that does send maybe a clearer message about China's foreign policy mindset and approach, right, that it's, going to put its money where its mouth is and could sort of basically suggest, right, that China is ready and prepared for, a continued downturn in relationship, right? And so that could dampen optimism, I think, among, some parties that, China is, willing to sort of come to reduce tension and be more conciliatory in its foreign policy approaches, right? And
Yeah.
I think, one interesting thing about China's approach to sanctions, right, having this informal model, right, I think often, allows foreign governments and companies to sort of have that spring of hope, right, that, there's perhaps, we can come to a better agreement, that we can have a more cooperative relationship, that we're gonna, continue to have access to the Chinese market. Um, and I think if China moves away from that, right, it sort of, could basically set the tone for a more negative relationship, or at least, allow voices to sort of, we have to gird ourselves, right, that China is going to be more coercive.
Something interesting in your research, I think, was, the idea that although there are these worries that China's going to become more aggressive in the realm of sanctions, that what we're seeing right now is actually that they still tend to be employing them pretty reactively. Do you think that is a policy preference of Beijing, or do you think they're currently constrained by the trade war with the US or by other factors, and that in the future they might move towards more proactive sanctions?
Yeah, I would say it's a mix of both. I think certainly the trade war has preoccupied, Xi Jinping and the Chinese government, right? And that's, had a lot of negative repercussions on their own economy as well. So I think, definitely on some level, right, China is sort of trying to focus on dealing with the trade war, dealing with the US and trying to come out of it as best as it can, right? And so that's why most of its focus, right, is on sort of responding to these coercive measures by the United States, as opposed to sort of launching its maybe more proactive sanctions in other domains against other countries. On the other hand, I think China's learning. I think it's sort of testing ground. It's saying, okay, if we use these measures, how do they work? Maybe they bring us some advantages, right? So that's definitely not ruling out the possibility, right, that this is allowing China to hone its toolkit, to refine to make it more confident, right, and figuring out what measures will be effective or not. And down the road, right, that it could, be less hesitant in using these formalized weapons against a broader range of countries.
And another key point I think that you brought up earlier was the idea of Taiwan, and that that's been a kind of an area where China is more likely to use formal sanctions. What role do you think nationalism or domestic politics and popular sentiment plays in shaping Beijing's sanctions decisions generally?
Um, I think, for Taiwan, because China considers Taiwan as a domestic issue,
Hmm.
and it's, an issue that's been sort of drilled into the Chinese public minds, right? That it's part of China. And as you mentioned, there's sort of been a lot of, decades of, nationalistic propaganda, right? Again, around sort of Taiwan status. And so I think, that sort of makes the Chinese government, right, more wary of sort of looking weak in front of the Chinese public. And so, in that regard, I think using formal sanctions allows Chinese government to more ex clearly say, look, this is what we're doing to stand up to foreign governments trying to, take Taiwan away from us, right? And because formally sanctions, you can clearly say we're doing this because, because of XYZ. And so it basically sends a clear signal to the domestic audience, and it allows the Chinese government to claim credit and saying, we're standing up for the Chinese nation and the Chinese people. And with Taiwan as a especially sensitive issue, right? I think, these formal sanctions are particularly useful in that.
Hmm. Yeah, and you and your authors have done, and people will see when they look at the article, a full breakdown of, how, where, and when, and why China is tending to use these sanctions, whether proactively, reactively, whether it's Taiwan or elsewhere. As scholars, students, whoever's watching this, look to kind of do future research, look into this further, what are areas that you're still curious about being kind of clarified or that people should pay attention to about how China's using their sanctions in new ways?
Um, yeah, I think one interesting thing would be sort of looking, this could be a hard sort of research question, but sort of looking within China and sort of
Mhm.
understanding the different institutions that are involved in the coordination of these economic sanctions and sort of looking at how trying to understand sort of the interplay, between these agencies and sort of the broader institutional changes that China is making to its bureaucracies to, implement these new tools, right? And if you look at a lot of Chinese language writings, right, Chinese scholars who are looking at the issue of economic sanctions, they often say we need to sort of improve our domestic institutions. We need to be able to sort of, we have all these new laws, right? How best can we implement them? And so I think understanding how China internally is trying to restructure its domestic capabilities, right, and capacities to adapt to a more coercive world and to sort of better use its new economic weapons would be an interesting field of study, and I think would be really valuable for anyone trying to understand China's approaches to economic statecraft. And I think part of our goal of having this new data set, which my co-authors Viking and Victor have also been really instrumental in building, and this is an ongoing effort, and we hope that it will be a useful sort of public good and resource for and scholars and policymakers, right, interested in this issue, right? So I think we just have to continue tracking these trends and see, what are some turning points, what are some factors that might push China, towards a more formalized or maybe what conditions it retains its informal approaches, and I think that's something that still bears watching.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, joining the Washington Quarterly and the Elliott School. This was great, great discussion, and I hope people go to your article in the newest edition of the Washington Quarterly. They can access it either on our website, twq.elliott.gwu.edu, or through our publishers, Taylor and Francis. Audrey, thank you again for joining me today.
Thanks, Rebecca. This was really fun.